According to the tradition of this university, we start this ceremony by a short prayer. Spiritus Sancti Gratia, illuminat sensus et corda nostra. Amen. Please sit down. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to this ceremony in which Roedolf Botha will defend in public his doctoral thesis, The Dynamics of Christian Religious Dialogue. A special welcome to the guests from outside this university, quite many today. Professor Joubert from South Africa, Professor Kirk from the United Kingdom, Professor Kok from South Africa, and Professor Weber from Belgium, and Professor Harry van Rooij, also South Africa. I hope I forget nobody. Huh? Professor Wils from Belgium? Okay, good. You wrote a doctoral thesis about a very important topic, Christian religious dialogue. We live in a time of religious conflict, so I'm looking forward to what you are going to tell us today, and I give the floor to you.
With the permission of the Council of Deans and in order to obtain the degree of Doctor at Radboud University Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my doctoral thesis entitled The Dynamics of Christian Religious Dialogue, a scientific investigation of two relevant scenarios. The aim was to investigate the dynamics of Christian religious dialogue. I investigated dialogue by studying two relevant scenarios in order to gain some insights into the dialogical process that could be helpful to the discussion in South Africa between the church in general and a culture that is becoming increasingly secular. One scenario was a key text from the New Testament that expresses a view of how the early church expanded in an approximate time of origin, but also represents some key source documents of that time reflecting on social discourse. I studied Acts 17, 16 to 34 by using known and established scientific hermeneutical theories and exegetical methods. The second scenario was the state of the current contemporary discussion in South Africa through the voice and works of Isaac Spannenberg. I studied Spannenberg's material by using a pool of his articles and books called S. In addition, some examples and wisdom from the world of narratology were employed, using an implicit observer and a scientific observer in an attempt to achieve maximum objectivity. From the beginning, the interest was more in the systems and structures of dialogue and not so much in certain individuals as such. As a result of this process, several insights surfaced. It is hoped that all the participants in the discussion, regardless of the nature of their persuasions and convictions, will learn from and use these insights to improve mutual understanding and enhance the quality of the response by each party towards the other. The insights gained extended over many areas, namely the person of the participant, the scope of study material, the structure of the content, rhetoric and persuasion, cultural common ground, and epistemology. Firstly, a few comments on the person. This entails the importance of the person's own inner and intellectual readiness for the discussion and involves awareness about personal presuppositional foundations and biases. The outcome of a discussion is determined seemingly not simply by the content discussed, but especially by the presuppositional basis on which it stands. What seems to be needed is proper and critical self-reflection and thoughtful hermeneutical consideration in preparation of dialogical engagement. It seems that it would be helpful if safe hermeneutical rules could be agreed upon by all parties prior to discussion. Secondly, the structure of content. This point addresses how certain bodies of knowledge relate to other parts of knowledge within a broader worldview. By this is meant that most content by nature appears to be structural and hierarchical, in the sense that not all elements of a person's, institution, or church's convictions are equally significant as pertaining to a fundamental understanding and view of life. Accordingly, not all parts of knowledge are found to be on the same level of importance, especially in a theological debate. For example, in Acts 17, for the Lucan Paul, talking about Jesus and his resurrection is much more important than trying to convince the Athenians of, for example, the bloodline of Jesus, or Israel's wanderings in the desert, as mentioned in Acts 13. Consequently, it seems vital to distinguish between one's own core content and peripheral content, as well as discerning these categories in the narrative of one's intellectual opponent. Thirdly, epistemology. Epistemology, as a challenge of the dialogical process, has been inherently present throughout the study. For example, hermeneutical explanations was necessary because I needed to clarify how I was going to acquire the knowledge and insights from Acts 17 that I wanted to gain. The topics discussed in chapter 10 imply epistemology in some form or another. For example, when, as noted in chapter 10, faith and science are polarized as exclusively irreconcilable, the implication is that the scientific method, as some scholars understand it, supplies the only valid means of gaining knowledge, even about spiritual things, hence the epistemological nature of such claims. It seems therefore intellectually unbearable to engage in dialogue without considering sound and tested epistemological ideas. Fourthly, the scope of study material. This point is concerned with an ongoing openness during the research process, as well as with exploring all the major positions on a topic. It can easily happen that a scholar draws extensively on material that merely supports his or her own positions, while remaining under the unfortunate impression that he or she is doing proper research. The need is to counter this by widening the scope of material studied. It implies that a topic should be approached from a sufficiently informed pool of data and material that reflects a rich diversity of opinions, including those by unsympathetic readers, and that represents the basic mainstreams of thinking on the topic. Fifthly, the willingness to persuade and be persuaded. Dialogue is a rhetorical skill, and rhetoric is about persuasion. Consequently, the willingness to persuade and be persuaded should be embraced. Valuable knowledge should be worthy of persuasion. If it is not, why should a scholar maintain such a position himself? It also implies an honest willingness to really engage with the material and opinions of the opposing side, regardless of whether it severely challenges one's position and shakes one's convictions to the core. Opening oneself up for the challenges of the opponent can lead a person to deeper reflection, correction, and adapting one's own position. Perhaps this eagerness to grow and learn needs to be an underlying assumption for each participant in order to have meaningful dialogue. Sixthly and lastly, seeking common ground. The idea of peripheral content revealed by Act 17 in chapter 8 represents the notion of common ground between the participants in the communication process. In other words, to always attempt to communicate one's own core content in a language that reflects the other person's peripheral context. In other words, language that reflects culture, language, and other forms of common ground. This would include clearly defining certain terms and concepts and logically explaining arguments in order for one's opponent to gain the best possible advantage for properly understanding and intelligently reacting to one's own point of view. To gain this knowledge of the other party's peripheral content, of course, implies a vast amount of listening and attempt to honestly learn and understand the other. This seems to be the dynamics of Christian religious dialogue. I've presented the summary of my thesis. Having presented this summary of my thesis, I return the floor to you, Rector.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Professor Hermans, who was the chairperson of the manuscript committee.
Dear candidate, dear Roedolf, it's very nice to see you here, standing and defending your thesis. I firstly congratulate you with your thesis, entitled The Dynamics of Christian Religious Dialogue, a Scientific Investigation of True Relevant Scenarios. I'm impressed by it, of the kind of investigation you give of the two scenarios, Act 17, and also the debate of in South Africa, exploring the work of Isaac Spangenberg. However, my role in this meeting is not to give a laudation, but to take the role of a friendly critical respondent. I go back to the title of your thesis, The Dynamics of Christian Religious Dialogue. Now, firstly, the term dynamics. I cannot find a proper explanation of that term in your book. What I can find are the following statements. Page 6, you speak about principles of constructive dialogue. Page 7, principles of engagement. Again, something different, maybe. Page 227, the purpose of chapter 9 and 10 is the same as the entire study. Quote, I wish to understand the nature and trends of Christian dialogue. So now it's about nature and trends. And then again, page 228, what I want to do is to establish a methodology on subjective engagement. So, Roedolf, so what's the dynamics all about?
Okay.
Now, the second question. So what's Christian religious dialogue? Because also there, it's not precisely clear what you mean. It's like the concept of dynamics. It's a moving target, but you mean different and unequal things with it. At page 5, you say the book is about dialogue with a secular and pluralistic society. Then page 8, it's a dialogue between church and secular society. Church and society, okay. Then your analysis of Acts 17, it's a dialogue between Christian thought and Greek religious thought, but not a dialogue with secular society. And then page 7, it's about an ongoing dialogue in South Africa. And then it's a dialogue between, and lastly also you speak about a dialogue between faith and science. So it's not clear also in the book what you really mean with Christian religious dialogue. Please
Thank you, Honourable Sir. First, the dynamics. Perhaps I use the word dynamics as a very comprehensive term, as including all kinds of angles when it comes to dialogue, when it comes to some kind of engagement between two parties, especially when two parties disagree and when two parties stand over and against each other as opponents. I understand your observation, and perhaps I should have looked at it a little more closely. But I think what I've done is, when I use the word dynamics, I mean it as a broad term, including all kinds of dialogical engagements. So I must say I have used terminology in a broad sense, and perhaps not always in a very specific sense. What I mean by that is, when I sometimes talk about engagement and I talk about dialogue, perhaps I've used it interchangeably frequently. But I think the dynamics sums up what I was trying to investigate from a very, very broad perspective. What are some basic things?
What if you have chosen the term principles of Christian life? Why not? What would be missing?
Maybe principles would be too specific. I know we need to be specific.
Because at the end, so your statements about what should be in the dialogue have the character of principles.
Sorry?
Have the character of principles that should be behind that dialogue.
Yes, I use the word principles, I use the word insights, I use several other words as well, as you mentioned. The only way I can explain it is I thought in broad terms.
Okay.
And I'm a very inclusive thinker, sometimes unfortunately. Sometimes I include quite a variety of terms under one heading. When it comes to your question about what message about Christian religious dialogue, the same kind of thing. Like for instance, it could be said that in my bibliography there's very few titles with the word dialogue in it, but in effect it is all about the engagement between two parties. And again, I think I used it as a rather broad term. What I meant by the word Christian religious dialogue is merely the fact that I looked at dialogue from a consistent Christian perspective, as that is the background that I hail from.
Satisfied? And I'll give the floor to Professor Kok.
Reverend Botha, thank you very much for your book, which I really enjoyed using the whole of December and some more time to read through this page. And I know the history very, very well in South Africa. So I know exactly where you come from. I know the landscape very well. And there's one thing that jumped out of the book for me, which I want to challenge you about, which is really sensitive. And that is about what you claim to be Spannenberg's father complex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you read the work of James Hollis, Through the Dark Wood, and things like that, from a Jungian perspective and so on, I mean, we all have father complexes, and we project that in certain ways.
Sure.
Fundamentalist people do that, but liberal people like Spannenberg, chapter 9 in your book, around about 100, page 199 and 200 and so on, you describe what happens to him, but then you make a statement there implying that he had a problem with his own dad, and that he has a sort of a father complex. Can you please just verify that? Have you spoken to him directly about that? And why I'm asking that is, I happen to know his son, who is married to an ex, not of mine, but when I was a minister of church, a student,
Sure.
you know, a youth person who is now married to Spannenbergs, and I can promise you he doesn't have a father complex, but you say it in the book. But anyway, can you just tell me what you think about that?
Yeah. If I try to think what I've actually said there, if you can read the quote, it'll actually help me. But what I meant by the whole idea is he uses his story. He uses his own story extensively. It's not something that I wanted to explore necessarily. He talks in his book, Jesus of Nazareth, Afrikaans, Jesus van Nazareth, he talks in his book about how he grew up and how he had a sort of a very primitive sort of faith when he was little, and he grew up and he went into a second phase and a third phase. My problem is not with the fact that he used his story, but he uses it in such a way. I think he uses it too uncritically, if I may make a judgment on that. He doesn't use hermeneutical theory to position himself and to say, listen, I acknowledge that this is where I am, this is my background, and here's the hermeneutical or exegetical tools that I use to sort of keep my story at bay so that I can use it in an academic sense, but not that it can, but in such a way that it wouldn't influence the outcome of my research. And he uses that quite strongly as a reason. Well, he doesn't, use the words, this is a reason to change your opinion, but the way he uses his story implies to a large extent, look at me, I've changed through this is what happened to me. It could be implied that this is also what should happen to you when you read this. So I think that's what I was going for. I can't remember the word, I'm embarrassed to say, father complex.
You didn't use it, but that was strongly implied from a Jungian perspective.
Knowing what I wanted to say, this is probably what I meant by that. That he used his story. He goes too far, I think, in using his story.
Then a follow-up question on that would be, why does many of the UNISA people commit vatermoord?
Vatermoord, can you explain to me?
Why do they depart from their orientation, disorientation, reorientation? Why do they all tell the same kind of meta-narrative story of being in a naive faith, suddenly being confronted, sort of a paternalistic, white sort of perspective, and then suddenly deconstructed within the UNISA context, being enlightened, and then coming out on the other side in opposition to the Afrikaner identity, which they then associate with sort of a Nazism, etc.
Yeah.
There's sort of a departing. Clifford Skritsinger does the same. Many others, I would say.
Yeah. It might not be that it happens within the UNISA context. I knew Spannenberg lectured in New Testament at the RAU, the Rans Afrikaans University, before he went to UNISA. And you already have some of these sympathies. So I don't know if it's the UNISA context. If it is indeed, maybe it's a kind of context that really conditions person in a certain way. I'm really not sure. You ask me something that I'm not sure I have the answer to. But first of all, I would say I'm not sure whether it is the UNISO context. Maybe he had those kind of presuppositions ahead of, before he already went there. If it is, if that happens frequently, that scholars go there, and in that context they change, maybe it's just they all think in a certain way, and it's a very strong conditioning context. And I don't mind that happening, as long as there is a recognition that there are academically viable sides on the other side as well. From the more, let's say, for a lack of a better word, the more conservative side, or the more, the side that would more claim belief. I don't mind that. Just don't make as if your opinion or the opinion of those group of people, we're the only ones that are, worth listening to, and the others are just plain biased. That would be my best attempts, I think.
Yeah. I now give the floor to Professor Wills.
Yes, thank you, dear candidate Botha. I think the discussion, the ongoing discussion, somehow anticipates my question now, so I can better understand the role of the two worldviews of Spannenberg. I mean, because I'm not familiar with the background of
I understand.
With the biographical background, but so I have a question about these two worldviews and about a raising problem in this opposition that causes, I think, some problems in your ethical considerations at the end of the book, but perhaps that will be part of a second question later on. Okay. So these two worldviews, they are rather complicated. I mean, I have a complex with these worldviews. I have no further complex with Spannenberg, but I have an academic...
Which two worldviews are referring to, Spannenberg's and?
The A and B worldview that are discussed at page 310. Yeah.
Page 310.
Page 310.
Oh, sorry.
Pages. No, and
okay.
So there's.
I know where we are.
There seems to be a kind of intrinsic relationship between Jesus with a high Christology. So this is the first world view. That usually goes hand in hand, as that's a quotation now, with being unscientific, prone to oppression, like apartheid, lack of love and compassion. So it's somehow linked to injustice.
Yeah.
The second one, I mean, so the Jesus with a low Christology seems to be intrinsically linked to justice. Mm. Yeah. So I have, first of all, a kind of historical remark. I give you an example from the German theology during the Second World War, during the Nazi Imperium. So Karl Barth, the godfather of Protestant theology in the 20th century, so his theology was the ideological basis for the Bekennenden Kirche, the confession church, that opposed to the Nazis.
Yes. Yes.
But his Christology was really a high Christology. Yeah. So, I mean, I should ask this question perhaps to Spannenberg, but so you are now his advocate, so to speak. But is there any evidence that there is an intrinsic relationship between high Christology and some political consequences, apartheid consequences, revolutionary consequences, etc., etc.? So that seems to be a kind of basic problem in both worldviews, that they suppose that there is a kind of immediate intrinsic relationship between Christology and politics. I mean, I have the impression that it's a very, very dangerous statement, and there is no historical evidence that it works like this.
I think when I listen to your question, it's as though I hear myself speaking, because that was exactly my problem with those two worldviews, or the way in which Spannenberg expressed them. Mm-hmm. The purpose of that piece of research was not to prove Spannenberg wrong, to say to him, Jesus with a low Christology necessarily that he's indeed right. My point was exactly that you get people with a high Christology that would do injustice, but you would also get people with a high Christology that uses that very same Christology in a way that they experience God commanding them not to commit violence, not to commit injustice. In other words, that becomes that same Christology that Spannenberg uses to say that it causes injustice is the same Christology that some scholars use to say, let's oppose this evil. Let's oppose Nazism. A good example would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the Second World War. He had a high Christology as well. He opposed, the other one would be, on the Catholic side, Stauffenberger. And they both had high Christologies, and they opposed the violence of the Second World War, especially the Nazism that came from Hitler. So that was exactly my point, that Spannenberg shouldn't be a fundamentalist about that. That you have people with a low Christology that can be on both ends of the ethical equation.
Yes, but that's a very interesting consideration now, but that means, in consequence, that there will always be a kind of gap between Christology, in general, between theological language, between religious convictions on the one side, and political or even moral implications of that on the other side. So there's something between. And what is this between? I mean, but this would be part of my second question about morals, but I think that I'm running out of time now. But
Okay.
Perhaps I have the opportunity to ask.
Thank you, Honourable Sir.
Thank you.
I now give the floor to Dr. Ackermans.
Dear candidate, dear Mr. Botha, reading your PhD thesis, I was very much interested in the way the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa applied discipline regarding the writings of the biblical scholar Spangenberg. Because applying discipline is a kind of, very specific kind of religious Christian dialogue. This seems to be a dialogue which failed. As a Catholic Church lawyer, I'm especially interested in the way churches and ecclesiastical communities used to deal with doctrinal dissidents.
Yes.
I will focus on the conflict of Spangenberg with the authorities of his church, his former church, because nowadays he calls himself a kerklidmaatschapsloze Christen. Spangenberg has called the way Dutch Reformed Church authorities have treated him as ongenaakbaar, harsh and unapproachable, and it does not need a Dutch translation. In the mid-1990s, Spangenberg delivered a speech at an Old Testament conference in Stellenbosch. He was charged with heresy, but the charges were soon dropped. It appears that Spangenberg was charged because he did not acknowledge the uniqueness of the person of Jesus Christ. Well, it's my question, one of my questions, and perhaps you, well, it's up to you which you want to answer. Why were the charges dropped? Because he was no longer considered to be a heretic? If such charges are dropped, then some kind of public rehabilitation would be appropriate. Otherwise, the poor guy would still be a heretic. The publication of that very speech in article form was rejected by one of South Africa's most prominent theological magazines. Is the Niederduits Gereformeerde Theologische Tijdschrift, does it in any way represent the authority of the Church? The rejection of this article seems to have encouraged Spangenberg to continue his writing. In 1989, he published Perspectieven op die Bijbel, a history of early modern biblical hermeneutics. Spangenberg's new insights contributed to a destabilization of what he calls the major Christian master narrative. Well, a new element in the chain of events was the series of lectures in 2002 on the occasion of John Dominic Crossan's visit to Pretoria, which leads in the end to the Nieuwe Hervorming Netwerk. In November 2002, a complaint of heresy against Spangenberg has been laid to his home congregation, who took some months to inform Spangenberg about the complaint. The Church Council of the home congregation referred the complaint to the Ring of Littleton, so organization of higher authority. They again, according to Spangenberg, did not want to pursue the case, and Spangenberg had to inquire himself about the procedure. A designated church commission of the Ring of Littleton, a respected group of theologians and pastors, proposed that Spangenberg would simply confess to the doctrines that Jesus died for our sins and that he rose bodily from the dead. This Spangenberg did refuse, because it had nothing to do with the original charge as it was made public to him, the denial of original sin. And then there is the rather cryptic sentence, well, it was cryptic to me, op grond van al die gebeuren beland ik in 2004 dus buiten die NG. Official reports are not available to the public because of its strictly confidential nature. Strictly confidential, it's a clear instruction, but for historians it never helps. It's the encouragement, divulge it as soon and as wide as possibly. Historians are very fond, therefore, of those documents which are labeled strictly confidential. Do you have a clue what might actually have happened in this designated church commission, and what do you think of the Christian dialogue character of this procedure?
Yes, I tried to, as you can see in one of my appendixes, I really tried to acquire that. You just mentioned the highly confidential nature of some of that knowledge. I was very, very disappointed when I couldn't get my hands on what happened there. I think there are two sides to the story. First of all, in telling that part of what happened to Spangenberg, that's in chapter 9, I actually told it as thoroughly as I could to be as objective as possible so that the reader reading my book could really also see where Spangenberg comes from. That there was some emotional damage done to him, that the way that this narrative played out was in many respects unfortunate. On the other hand, as a matter of fact, I just need to add that when I read my own chapter, specifically those parts that you've pointed out to me just now, Honourable Sir, is that I sympathize with Spangenberg in many, many respects. The other side of the case, however, is that the nature of the Dutch Reformed Church, and by the way, I don't represent the church in any way today anymore. I'm actually not part of the denomination anymore. But the nature of the Dutch Reformed theology is it's a confessional kind of church. In other words, its constitution, made up of theological insights and doctrines, are extremely important in maintaining the specific character of this church. So when Spangenberg wrote these articles that were in direct conflict with these confessions, the people got together, the specific commission, like you said, the one was dropped. The next one they felt was much more of a fundamental nature to the theology of the Dutch Reformed Church. And the piece that you read was so apt because there I felt they wanted to make it as easy as possible for Spangenberg not to leave by just saying, just accept the resurrection of Jesus, because in Christian circles, in that specific confessional circle, it's the most fundamental, most basic thing that you can still hold on to and still remain part of this church. So they try to take everything away and just pose this one most fundamental thing to him. And I know one of the persons that was part of the commission was Professor Adrian Koenig, and I know his attitude would specifically be, not to berate Spangenberg in any way, but to, although he's on the more conservative side, but to rather have positive dialogue. So my opinion is, I think it's really unfortunate the way that a lot of those dialogue took place and played out. On the other hand, they did, the positions that Spangenberg took in the end, fell outside of the confessional nature of that church. And I think that was the big problem in the end. I hope that satisfies your curiosity.
Yes, thank you.
I now give the floor to Professor Weber.
Thank you. Candidate, I congratulate you on this achievement, and I was very interested by reading your dissertation. There's a potpourri of a lot of general information that was filled in a lot of the context, especially in the first part, and I greatly appreciated the information about the South African context, which I know very little of. Now I know a little bit more of than I did before. Thank you very much. My question concerns the first part of your dissertation that deals with Acts 17 and your methodology in dealing with the passage that you cited, verses 16 to 34. In one of your general comments, you talked about one of the criteria for sound dialogue concerns the scope of material treated. And I'd like to apply that insight in raising questions in regard to a statement you make on chapter 6, where you say that you methodologically intended to study a key source text, such as Acts 17, 16 to 34, played a forming role in the dialogical mission of the early church. I guess that in that connection, my question has two parts. One is, on what basis would you identify part or all of this text as a dialogue in the first century sense of the term? And in relation to that, where would you place this form of dialogue along the continuum of the form or the process as it was in practice in the late first century and second century, of course, in other Greek and Latin literature, Christian and non-Christian?
Thank you, Honourable Sir. First of all, the choice of the point of choosing Acts 17. I think if we look at the history of the Christian Church, the first 3 centuries, when we read books like those of Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity, we see that the Christian Church did something right in the sense, now that's a judgment statement, but in the sense that they grew rapidly, as well as maintaining a kind of a worldview that treated their fellow human beings with respect, that helped them look after the poor. And to me it was very important to look at some of the first century source documents which served as a foundation for this kind of transformation. So to me it was extremely important to look at some text in the New Testament. Of course, there are, it's always difficult if you have something like the New Testament to choose a metaphor, to choose a narrative. Which one do you choose? The reason I chose Acts 17 is in the book of Acts. Luke is seen as the first historian by a lot of New Testament scholars, the second being possibly Eusebius in the 4th century. And he's the only one that we really know of that tells the story the way he does. And when we look at the development of the Acts story, we see Acts 17 coming out as a kind of a climax. Martin Debelius confirms this, that the reason I say this is many scholars, or some scholars, point to the fact that Acts 17 might not have been such a great example. Because it seems to have been a failure. A lot of people scoffed at the end, and Paul never did that again. Now, the reason I quote Debelius is, and of course several other scholars, is the way Luke wrote the story, it really seemed like a climax. And I think we should look at the way that Luke defines failure. I don't necessarily think that Acts 17 was a failure. If you look at a lot of other things that happened previous to that, and even after that, Stephen got stoned. Paul himself got stoned in Acts 14 at Lystra. So how's that for a failure? Going back to the point that Paul never did that previous to Acts 17 and never did it again after that I disagree with, in the sense that it looks differently on the surface because Athens was the only place that they actually addressed Athenian philosophers. And he had to address intellectuals, but fundamentally or conceptually, I think he did the same thing he did in all other speeches in Acts, namely to keep to a core confession, but elaborate on the fringes. So my choice of Acts 17 is, I think that's the first thing, historically speaking, the early church did something right, so their confessions would be very important to me, and in that sense, Act 17 would be very important. Also, historically speaking, it's a event where there's cross-cultural engagement, and I think that was a very, very important point to me. Of course, there's cross-cultural engagement in several other points as the church expands in Acts. But I think Act 17 is one of the most elaborative. I didn't want to use Acts 13, where Paul speaks to the Jews, because that's too close to his own background. So I wanted an example that's most elaborative, but that puts Paul on the spot in the sense that he had to do some really cross-cultural engagement. And I think that was the main reason I chose Act 17, because again, I'm a big picture thinker and I'm an inclusive thinker. So what I mean by that is, applying that on the situation in South Africa, Paul is on the Areopagus, engaging with people fundamentally different than himself. And it was those principles that I was interested in.
Okay, let me sharpen my question, because I'm not sure if you have responded to it.
Okay.
I'm talking about the word dialogue and the fact that you talk about missional dialogue as formative in the early church.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
You have not yet responded to the question about what makes Luke 17:16 to 34 a dialogue.
Thank you.
And then where it fits within the other forms of dialogue that we can compare it with in Greek, Latin, and early Christian literature.
Thank you. If we look at the first few verses, from verse 16 to 21, we see that Paul engages like a kind of a Socrates in the synagogue, on the agora, which has a very much dialogical nature to it. So I think the table is being set for the Areopagus speech on Mars Hill by the context, which starts in dialogue on equal footing. Socrates was known for the fact that he dialogued with every kind of person, dialegetu, that it happened to pass by. That's the same kind of impression, probably, that Luke might want to create. And so that sets the table. That opens up the context for the Mars Hill discourse. Now, on Mars Hill, his speech itself is much more like a one-direction kind of engagement. But if you see it, how some of the people reacted in the end, saying to him, we've heard you and we want to engage with you again. So that tells me that the whole feel or the nature of the event might have been of a dialogical nature. Perhaps they went on afterwards and had some more discussion. So I think there's enough there to think that it's dialogical in nature. In other words, communicate on equal footing with one another.
Okay, and what about the context of other examples of dialogue and development in the early church? Because that's a statement you make, but then I don't see it followed up. You can't do everything in your dissertation. You have a lot of information.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you would go further to support that claim. That's the case. Because later on in your dissertation, you talk about the uniqueness of Acts 17, and I find it difficult to reconcile this as formative in the dialogue with Ducal Mission and yet not repeated. I don't see how it could be both.
Yeah. Well, again, if we think of the fact in the first 3 centuries, the Christian church was mostly vervolged. Persecuted, thank you. The kind of engagement there had to have been was one that's not a top-down kind of thing. You cannot impose the gospel by power. It's a thing that you tell the story and you let people make up their own minds. It was not at all imperialistic, and in that sense, I think it makes sense to me to think that dialogue would fit at least in the first 3 centuries. Because they
Can you cite any concrete examples that are follow-ups like Acts 17?
Well, perhaps we can look at the rhetorical style in which some other New Testament books have been written. If Paul says, first of all, if Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, I become for a Jew, and for a Greek, he means I sacrifice myself. I go to them on equal footing. I want to engage with them. We can look at, of course, the cultural relevant metaphors used in other books. The book of John, where he poses Jesus as the Logos, which was a term both accepted in Greek and Jewish philosophy. The way that says to me something about dialogical nature, because he does not come with an imperialistic, top-down, I'm right, you wrong kind of way. He really tries to engage, to penetrate the culture, to listen to the culture enough so that it would make sense to them. That's the best way I can probably explain that.
And yet there's a great difference between the form of Acts 17 and other non-Christian examples of dialogue that we have in the first 3 centuries. How do you explain that?
You mean...
I mean non-Christian examples. Like Plutarch and Lucian, they would be the most prominent examples. But even if we go to the 2nd century and talk about Christian examples, such as Justinius, it seems to me a wide gap between those forms and content and then what we see in Acts 17.
Well, I think Acts 17, if we take Ben Witherington seriously, and there are scholars as well, we might refer to Lausberg as well, that Luke follows a certain rhetorical style that was very... known in the Greek culture. Rhetoric was a school subject in the 1st century. And because of the fact that the Greek culture was a democracy in those days, rhetorical skills made it very important. So Paul uses some of that insights that would definitely adhere to Greek thinking. Maybe not to all kinds of Greek thinking, but surely the Greek culture was pluriform and had a lot of different nuances. But it would definitely relate, I think, to a few of them.
Okay, thank you very much.
There is some 15 minutes for a second round, so I return the floor to Professor Hermans.
Here I'm back again. Section 4, you advocate an idea of dialogue. It sounds like an exchange of perspective or perspective taking. But your concept of dialogue here seems to very much touch what I would call a modality of strong rationality. For example, when you speak about a person, page 321, you say one presuppositions form a part of the meta-theoretical foundations on which a position is being built and can influence and determine the flow of outcome of the discussion. But then you have some strong idea about the possibility to have knowledge of all your presuppositions and to be able to state them into a dialogue. And then when you speak about the structure of content, you again have a very strong concept. Page 324, viewing knowledge as, and then, quote, structured and hierarchical. Help me to avoid the dialogical process of being trapped in unimportant and insignificant issues. Now, I'm Catholic. The Vatican II has introduced the term hierarchy of truths. Now, the good thing in the Catholic Church is that since Vatican II, it has never provided a document in which they present a structure and a hierarchical way of the Christian faith. So they mentioned it, but never produced any document to back it up.
Okay.
Also, on this, you have a strong concept of the willingness to be persuaded. Dialogue is about persuasion. You quoted it also in your summary. And when I think speaking about faith and dialogue about faith, I think it's a subjective truth based on attestation, and so here again, it's far too strong for me. The willingness to be persuaded. Then you have also a very strong concept of constructing common ground. Okay, I leave it with it. But what are your reasons, Roedolf, to opt for such a strong model of rationality? You don't give them. And did you consider other models, like a more conversational idea, for example, of Jeff Stout, ethicist in Princeton? What are your alternatives?
Thank you.
And how does this strong rationality fit your object of theology, which you define as knowledge of God? So I was quite amazed at the end of this beautiful book to have this very strong concept of dialogue.
Thank you, Honourable Sir. First of all, I think it boils down to why I chose... those results came to the surface because of the two relevant scenarios that I've studied. And the reason I chose those two scenarios is those are the two most relevant probably in my work in ministry today. In other words, the ancient confessions of the early church, that is very authoritative in the world that I live in and the work that the world that I work in, and that is the world that I would like this thesis to have an impact. The second thing, Spannenberg is the most vocal proponent of this discourse on a bottom line level that's going on. So these are the reasons I chose these two scenarios, and what you've pointed out to me is that rose from the study of these two scenarios. Now, the whole idea of the hierarchical, yes. Do you want to sharpen your question?
Rose out of it. It's your choice. You
Sure.
you use a model also in which you construct core idea and then the peripheral ideas and culture and language. And so also to be able to make this distinction in matters of faith.
Yeah.
And that you choose a kind of methodology which brings you to this very strong rationality. But why do you want to go that side? If you preach...
Yes, yes.
Probably it's not strong rationality, or not?
Oh, probably it's a combination of rationale, experience, and whatever else is important to human experience.
Sorry, let the candidate talk.
The reason I point, for instance, to the hierarchical structure of knowledge, it's not, that doesn't refer to the methodology being hierarchical. It's merely a common sense insight that arises out of the two studies that indicate that each and every person has certain biases. Each and every person has a specific strong point of departure. It doesn't matter whether you're a relativist or a agnostic or a theist or a Muslim. It's very human to have a very strong point of departure from which you engage in any kind of dialogue. And when I say that content is structured hierarchically, I merely mean that for the relativist or the humanist, there are some truths in his whole frame of reference that are more important than others. Human freedom, for instance, might be a very, very, if you take Berger and Luckmann's whole idea of a symbolic universe, in which you have certain symbols with certain hierarchies. He might have his own kind of symbols that is in hierarchy much higher than some. Human freedom might be a very strong one. For example, he might not feel so strong about something else necessarily. That's the only thing that I mean when I talk about knowledge being structurally, being hierarchically structured. It just means we have certain elements of the content of what we believe that we consider to be more important than others. That's the only thing. And when I say, yes, so have I personally, but I think I've attempted hermeneutically to keep my biases at bay, and I think that's the important thing. The question is not whether I have a strong point of departure. I think we should assume, we can assume, there's enough evidence to assume that most of us have. The point is rather, do I use sound theories, do I use sound methodologies to help me be as objective as I can be with the bias that I have or with the strong opinion that I have on certain things? And that's why I said it's not just important to persuade, but also to be persuaded. In other words, there should be a very strong, I might have very high values or symbols in my symbolic universe that are very high. But a real openness, dialogue cannot take place if I'm not prepared to listen to you in such a way that I'm also prepared to change my own, to to be persuaded myself.
You can continue this conversation during the reception. I now give the floor to Professor Kok.
Simple question. Bultmann struggled with a three-storied universe. Bultmann preached. Okay? In what way do you think is Spannenberg going further than Bultmann did?
I'm not that familiar with Bultmann. I'm sure there could have been much more sophisticated proponents of a three-story universe kind of concept. I only engage with Spannenberg. So in the way that Spannenberg uses the whole idea of three-story universe, I think lacks some serious extra reading material. He lacks some more sophisticated thinking. Perhaps Bultmann's idea is much more viable. I don't have any knowledge of Bultmann's three-story universe idea.
Okay, now for the South African context, that's quite important. I would suggest rather that we leave it there, but read Bultmann seriously.
Thank you.
And see where Spannenberg goes and compare it to Bultmann. But okay.
Thank you.
Professor Wills, 5 minutes for a question and an answer.
My question should be shorter. I mean, so you remember the discussion about my first question about the relationship between the theological language, relevation on the one side, and political, moral issues on the other side. And I said there is a gap between them. I mean, so there is no necessary logical relationship between, for example, the high Christology and apartheid, I would say. But okay, so now I have a question about the ethical consequences of that, and I think page 316, that to some extent you have become the victim of this kind of worldview thinking yourself. Mm-hmm. So I give a small quotation, and so you start from the Spannenberg human unresurrected Jesus, you know. So and then you say such a Jesus can perhaps serve as a result of oppressive. Such a Jesus can perhaps serve as inspiration or noble example, but certainly not as divine moral revelation. Moral revelation. If Jesus has no divine authority to command love and forgiveness from his subjects, why would anyone feel obliged to follow him? Last sentence, from a philosophical point of view, knowledge of morality usually stems partly from a certain authority. So these sentences are not that complicated, but their consequences are very complex, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to formulate it in a very short way.
Sure.
So what is the relationship between moral knowledge and relevation? Our other question: does obligation derives from authority? So does moral obligation derives from authority? What is the relationship between moral knowledge and relevation? But because you seems to say that obligation needs authority, even divine authority, even relevation.
Yes.
And I'm very much in doubt about that. So what about the autonomy of morals?
I deeply appreciate the complexity of ethics in philosophy and of the complexity to decide what is really morally right and what is wrong. My point there, again, the moral authority, moral knowledge doesn't need to come from authority. We have usually, as I understand philosophy, there are basically three sources of knowledge. We have reason, we have experience, and we have a kind of authority. All of us have some kind of authority, whether it's a book we read or a person we trust. Okay. So we all have authorities. The benefit of a God that came to reveal himself is just that he made it rather clear. I'm not saying that's what all of us should believe. I'm just saying that can become a benefit. And the reason I point that out is not that I want to coerce any kind of view on the reader, it's merely because I experience Spangenberg imposing some kind of other, some kind of morality on the basis of his Christology.
Okay.
And that's all I try to point out. It's not that simple. That's actually what I was trying to say to Professor Spangenberg. It's not that simple. We have to think of alternatives. So I merely tried to pose an alternative, and the alternative I used was the exact one that Spangenberg was against. So that's the only reason I chose it. It happens to be my own persuasion as well, but it is, I think, it was meant to be a mere example of the fact that Spangenberg should just reconsider his point of view and his whole idea between Christology and morality.
Okay, so thank you.
The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my doctoral thesis to the best of my ability, I would like to thank the rector and my supervisors, as well as those who have honored the ceremony with their presence.
The Doctoral Examination Board retreats for its deliberation. The Council of Deans of Radboud University Nijmegen has decided to award you the degree of doctor. I invite Professor van der Wat to discharge the task assigned to him.
In the name of the Lord, with the power entrusted by law to the Council of Deans, I hereby confer upon you, Roedolf Botha, born in Kaapstad, the title of doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all the associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I and your other promoters present you with this doctoral diploma signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisors and co-supervisors.
Thank you.
Sit down.
Dear Dr. Botha, Roedolf, on behalf of myself, Professor Kirk, and Professor Hubert next to me, I want to congratulate you on your PhD. Baie geluk met hierdie mylpaal in jou lewe. Ek dink jy het dit terdee verdien. Ek is baie opgewonde oor die toekoms wat vir jou voorlê, en natuurlik ook wat jy reeds verrig het, want jy het 'n baie besondere talente wat jy ook baie goed in die praktyk kan aanwend. Daarom is ek so bly dat jy besluit het om hierdie studie aan te pak. Ek moet eerlik sê dat dit vir my 'n groot plesier was om jou kennis te sien groei. Jou hardwerkendheid en toewyding was altyd lekker om te beleef. Veral jou openheid teenoor die wetenskap, jou bereidheid om verskillende posisies te oorweeg, hoewel jy ook nie terugdeins om jou opinie te stel nie, jou vermoë om teorie en praktyk in gesonde balans te hou, is alles dinge wat bydra tot die persoon wat ek vandag sy doktersgraad kon gee namens ons almal. Op persoonlike vlak ken ek jou natuurlik al van jou vroeë studiejare af en jy was altyd 'n oogvanger, juis vanweë jou gebalanseerde en gesonde lewensuitkyk en persoonlike verhoudings. Dit het dit lekker gemaak om saam met jou die pad te loop. Jy het nie 'n maklike tema gekies nie, en soos ons oor en oor gesels het, is daar natuurlik baie hermeneutiese en retoriese slaggate in die tipe tema wat jy gekies het. Die feit dat een van die eksterne eksaminators, en ek het nou gehoor meerdere van hulle, maar hierdie een wat baie krities kan wees as hy wil, jou geprys het vir die manier waarop jy iemand wat duidelik problematiese en inkonsekwente standpunte in sy werk vertoon, op 'n sober, gebalanseerde en nie konfronterende wyse hanteer het. Dit is vir jou 'n pluimpie. Wat my veral bly maak, is dat ek sien dat jy die kennis wat jy opgedoen het, in jou daaglikse beroep gebruik. Dit maak al die energie en tyd wat jy ingeset het, meer as die moeite werd. Doodgewoon, omdat jy nou, na my mening, 'n meer afgeronde en ingeligte teoloog is, en wat jouself ook as sodanig in jou werkskringe laat geld. Nogmaals geluk en baie sukses vir die toekoms, waarin ek en jy sekerlik ook nog gaan saamwerk. Jou vriend Jan en dan ook Stefan en Ander.
Baie dankie, Jan. Groot voorreg.
Also, on behalf of the Council of Deans, I congratulate you with your book and your defense and your doctorate. My background is in missiology, and I specialize in interreligious relations, so I really enjoyed your defense and really the balanced way in you try to argue. And of course, there were some issues that maybe need some further development. So, if you have time, please write some articles about this very interesting topic. But once again, congratulations with your doctorate. We are now going to close this ceremony by a short prayer. Gratias tibi agemus, omnipotens Deus, pro omnibus beneficiis tuis, qui vivis et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.